you're doing the job that all of our journalism students dream about doing. How did your time at Carleton propel you to where you are now?
Well, first of all, thanks for all the really kind words. When I started at Carleton, I remember the very first day, and if there are any journalism students in the room, I hope this gives you some hope. The first day, the Journalism 100 class, and I won't name the professor in case I get it wrong, I think it was Roger Bird. He told us there were no jobs in journalism, and none of us were going to work in the field. And at that time, things looked incredibly bleak, as perhaps they do now for people who are aspiring journalists. And what he couldn't foresee was that there was going to be this massive change brought about by Conrad Black founding the National Post and creating all these jobs that allowed people like me to get into the industry. And hopefully there'll be another massive change ahead that sort of, again, creates that kind of opportunity. But, you know, how did Carleton help me get there? I mean, without having attended the school, you simply don't get into the interview process. You simply don't have, you're not prepared to step into a newsroom. And you have, when you get into an internship at the Globe and Mail or the Ottawa Citizen or the Oakville Beaver, you have to hit the ground in knowing what you're doing and being ready to contribute from day one, because you've got about 3 months to decide whether or not you're going to make it in this business. And thanks to Centertown News and the Charlatan, I got my hands are still covered in ink from touching one, but that was the best training ground I had was, and I never cared as much about a publication as I did when I was working for the Charlatan here.
So how did you get to Russia? How did you get to the Globe?
I like to say, or I was thinking about this, that my career was set in action by a fire in Pictou, Nova Scotia. Because I was supposed to work in my third year in the summer of 1996. I was supposed to be working at a place called the Pictou Advocate. I had been ignored by the Globe and Mail and the Toronto Star and the Ottawa Citizen when I was applying for jobs, but I'd found a job in Pictou, Nova Scotia. And one day in April of 1996, I think it was, I got a phone call from the editor of the Pictou Advocate who was telling me a very dramatic story that began with they'd had a fire and much of the newsroom had been burned, and the journalists had been running in to save the paper copies and get them back out. And one of the things that went up in smoke was their budget for an intern that summer. And so I was like, oh gosh, well that's very sad for you, but that's the end of my career, because next summer I'm going to have no clippings. There's no chance that I'll catch on at one of the papers that I wanted to work for. But I decided I wasn't going to give up, and I spent the night. I literally opened up a phone book and looked at, they had one of those maps showing all the time zones, and my eyes fell on South Africa. And I stared at it and said, I'm going to go work in South Africa. And I called the operator. I said, what's the directory assistance in South Africa? And then I called South African directory assistants and said, what are your 5 biggest cities? And I said, what's the name of the newspaper in those 5 cities? And I called all 5 newspapers that night and said, I'm going to come work for you for free. If it works out, you're going to start paying me after 2 weeks. And if it doesn't work out, well, I've had a really crappy vacation. And 3 of them took me up on the offer. And the reason why I think that was a big decision is before that moment, I actually wanted to be a sportscaster. I wanted to be one of those people who renamed, sort of had funny ways to describe a home run. A duck snort single to left field. And then after that, I from South Africa, not only did I work for a local paper, but I wrote one article for the Ottawa Citizen that I still sort of treasure, and came back, and I was so thrilled that people had seen what I was covering, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, through my eyes, that I'd been able to sort of contribute to people's understanding of a faraway part of the world. From that moment on, I decided I was going to be a foreign correspondent, and I got to Moscow largely by repeatedly threatening to quit the Globe and Mail and go back to Africa. And eventually they said, okay, do you want to go to China was the first thing. And I studied Mandarin for 2 weeks, and then it changed at Algonquin College. And then they suddenly said, okay, we're going to Moscow instead. It wasn't, at that point, it wasn't a chosen career course. It was very accidental, all started by a fire in Pictou.
So just remind me of the chronology of the postings that you've been through to where you are now in London.
I was sent to Moscow in late 2001, early 2002. I started working there, and in 2005 I moved to Jerusalem. and then to Beijing in 2008, and now London since then. But I worked a couple of years in Canada before that.
Okay, but you're not the London correspondent. What's the gig in London?
No, we have a lot of, Paul Waldy is our European correspondent based in the UK. We have Eric Regley, who covers European business for us out of Rome. So I'm technically, it makes me sound old, senior international correspondent. But what it means is that I'm supposed to be looking for stories that connect the dots. I can really go anywhere that I think, if I'm trying to explain a sequence of events. Susan kindly mentioned the Graffiti Kids story. That came out of us trying to think about how we got to this moment in time. And so there's no beat, there's no boundary. It's just trying to think globally about the planet and how it affects us and how we got to this moment in time.
Okay. I mean, we'll talk in a minute about your work in Russia when you were Russia correspondent for the Globe, but I'm just wondering, in your current beat, I mean, it's not really geographic, but it's kind of half the world. I mean, how does that work?
Haphazardly. We, like a lot of media organizations, we've had to trim our sails a bit. When I went abroad, we had a bureau in Moscow. We had a bureau in Jerusalem, like I mentioned. We used to have bureaus in India. All of these things, we've never really formally made a big declaration, but we've quietly closed down in all these different places. So about a good chunk of my job is going back to places that I used to live and trading on that experience and the contacts that I have in these places. But obviously we don't try and cover everything like we once did. We don't try and have a Globe and Mail byline on every international event like we once aspired to. We try and look for moments where we can leave a lot of it, the rest of it, to the news wires and try and weigh in on something larger where possible.